Hey everyone, welcome back to Reader's Podcast. You know, we love to do these deep dives every now and then, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the art of activism.
I'm happy to be here.
And um, I think the topic is especially timely right now.
Mm.
So much is happening in the world. So much feels kind of out of control, and maybe art can be a way to kind of take back some control and make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very powerful tool.
Yeah. So let's jump right in.
Yeah.
This book starts off with this incredible anecdote, and I love this story. Um, it's about these artists in the Balkans who decided to tackle a really persistent problem in their community, pothole,
Potholes, yeah.
like something that we can all relate to, right?
Everyone hates them.
And we complain about them, we call the city, but these artists thought of a completely different approach.
A more creative approach, yeah.
So what did they do?
Well, they grabbed some fishing rods and buckets, even a few fish,
Okay.
and they set up shop around this pothole and started fishing as if it were a lake.
I love it.
Such a great visual.
Yeah. That's such a great image. Like you can just picture it, right?
Absolutely.
And the best part is it worked.
It did. It got a lot of attention.
Yeah, it caught the attention of the local media, it made national news, and pretty soon the authorities were kind of forced to take action and they fixed the pothole.
Yeah. Nobody wants to be the laughingstock, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like this brilliant example of how art can be used to just disrupt the ordinary and make people pay attention to things that they might otherwise just ignore.
Right. It's like forcing them to see it in a new light.
Yeah. And this is what the book refers to as artistic activism, which I think is a really important distinction to make because it's not just about creating pretty pictures or expressing political opinions. It's about actually using art to achieve tangible change.
Yeah, it's about action.
Yeah. Like the book says, if we're going to build a better world, hell, if we're going to survive as a species, we need to change the world creatively.
Yeah, that's a powerful quote.
Yeah, it really is. It's kind of a call to action, I think.
And it really resonates with the times that we are living in right now with all the challenges that we're facing.
Right. It's like we're bombarded with information. We're bombarded with problems that seem almost insurmountable. And sometimes it feels like the traditional forms of activism, like petitions and protests and marches, they're just not enough anymore.
Right, like shouting into the void.
Exactly. And the book even makes this analogy to the emperor's new clothes. You know, it's like even if we present people with the truth, it doesn't always lead to action.
Right. You can give people all the facts and figures in the world,
Right.
but it doesn't mean that they will actually change their behavior.
And I think art can kind of bypass that, bypass those intellectual defenses and hit us on a much deeper level.
Absolutely.
Like the difference between reading a news article about climate change and watching a documentary that makes you really feel the urgency of the situation.
Yeah, and speaking of that, the book goes on to explore how even historical figures like Jesus used artistic activism to get their message across. Yeah, it talks about how Jesus used these really powerful visuals like, walking on water, feeding 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and fish.
Right.
These were all spectacles. They're these public displays that really captured people's attention and got them thinking about his message.
Yeah.
And the book emphasizes how important that is, this idea of demonstrating politics, not just talking about them.
It's like showing, not telling.
Exactly.
And that brings us to another powerful demonstration. Rosa Parks' iconic act of defiance on that segregated bus.
Right. Such a powerful moment in history.
But here's something that really surprised me when I read this. The book reveals that her famous photograph was actually a staged performance. It was deliberately crafted to convey a powerful message.
So it wasn't this spontaneous act of defiance that we've all come to believe?
Well, it was an act of defiance, but it was strategically planned.
Interesting.
And I think that's fascinating because it highlights how even seemingly spontaneous acts of resistance can be really carefully thought out and executed to maximize their impact.
Yeah, and the civil rights movement really understood the power of imagery.
Exactly.
They used clothing and visual symbols very deliberately to communicate their message.
Right. Like the book talks about how they used those protest signs, the freedom songs, the way they dressed.
Yeah, all of those visual cues work together to create a really powerful and unified message.
And that's something that the Black Panthers also did really effectively.
Absolutely. They understood the power of presentation.
Right. Like their whole aesthetic,
Yeah.
the black leather jackets, the berets, the afros.
It was a very deliberate choice, a way to project strength and unity.
And then we have the United Farm Workers who used boycotts marches, and they even appropriated cultural symbols like the Virgin of Guadalupe,
Right.
to champion the rights of these marginalized laborers.
Which is really interesting when you think about it, because they were taking these symbols that were already deeply meaningful to people,
Right.
and they were using them to represent a new vision of justice and equality.
So it's not just about creating new things. It's also about reclaiming and repurposing existing cultural elements.
Exactly. It's about tapping into that existing cultural energy and redirecting it towards a new goal.
And the book makes this really interesting point about the way our brains work and how we process information.
Hmm.
It says, the more scientists have studied how the mind works, the more they've come to realize that those very effective qualities of the arts that move us are essential to how we think.
Hmm. So art is not just some frivolous add-on.
Right. It's actually a fundamental part of how we make sense of the world.
And how we make decisions.
Yeah. And that challenges this idea that we're these purely rational beings driven by logic alone.
Because our emotions play a huge role in shaping our beliefs and our actions.
Absolutely. And the book talks about this concept they call the Matlock method of political persuasion.
Matlock, the TV show.
Yeah, which is this idea that if we just present people with enough evidence, they'll magically change their minds.
Yeah, if only it were that simple.
Right. But in reality, it's so much more complicated than that.
Right.
Because our brains are constantly creating these narratives and stories to make sense of the world around us.
Right, we try to connect the dots and find meaning.
And those stories are often more influenced by our emotions and our personal experiences than by cold, hard facts.
Exactly. So if you really want to change someone's mind, you need to understand those stories.
Right.
And find ways to weave your message into them.
Like tap into those existing narratives that people already hold.
Right. Find a way to make it personal and relevant to their lives.
And this reminds me of a time when I was trying to convince a friend of mine to change their mind about a particular issue. And I presented them with all this evidence, all these logical arguments. But it was like talking to a brick wall.
I've been there.
And then I came across this piece of art. I think it was a song. And it addressed the same issue, but in a really emotional and powerful way.
Mm.
And guess what? It totally shifted their perspective.
So it wasn't the logic, it was the emotion that got through.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's powerful.
And the book actually talks about how our brains literally create these neural pathways based on learned associations, forming these stories that help us make sense of the world.
So we're literally hardwired for stories.
And if you want to change someone's mind, you need to understand those existing stories and find ways to introduce new elements and new perspectives that can challenge those assumptions and potentially reshape their whole worldview.
So it's about disrupting those old stories and creating new ones.
Exactly. And that reminds me of this funny thing that happened to me the other day. I was driving home from work. It's a route that I take almost every single day. And I could not for the life of me remember if I had stopped to pick up groceries.
Oh.
It was like my brain was on autopilot, completely zoned out. And it made me realize how much of our lives we spend stuck in these routine thought patterns, just completely oblivious to what's happening around us.
That's interesting.
Right. And I think that's why art can be so powerful.
Yeah.
Because it can break us out of those patterns.
Yeah, it can shake us awake.
Yeah. And the book actually talks about how surprise and disruption can be incredibly powerful tools for making us receptive to new ideas.
So it's about jolting us out of our comfort zones.
Exactly.
Making us pay attention.
And one of the best examples of this, and the book mentions this a few times, is Duchamp's urinal.
Ah, yes, the famous urinal.
Can you imagine how shocking it must have been back in 1917 to see something so ordinary, so out of place, displayed in an art gallery?
I can imagine.
Like, it completely disrupted people's expectations of what art could be.
And forced them to reevaluate their whole understanding of the world.
And the book argues that this principle applies not just to visual art, but to all forms of artistic activism. It's about disrupting those expectations, challenging the status quo, and making people see the world in a new light.
And that can be a very uncomfortable experience for some people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also necessary for growth and change.
Yeah, it's how we evolve.
And the book also introduces this really interesting concept. And I have to admit, I had never heard of this before. Disasterbation.
Disasterbate.
It refers to our tendency to get fixated on these dystopian futures. You know, we find this kind of perverse comfort in contemplating these worst-case scenarios.
Oh, yeah. We love to imagine the end of the world.
Right. It's like we're drawn to those doomsday predictions, even when they fill us with anxiety and dread.
Like a car crash, you can't look away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book argues that while it's important to be aware of the problems, to make the invisible visible, constantly dwelling on these negative scenarios, can be paralyzing.
Right. It can lead to a sense of hopelessness and despair.
Exactly. And it prevents us from actually taking action and imagining and working towards a better future.
So how do we break out of that cycle?
Well, that's where the concept of utopia comes in. And that's something we'll definitely explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
Some good.
But I think it's a really important counterpoint to this idea of disastrobation.
Yeah, we need to balance those dystopian visions with utopian ones.
Right. Because if we can't even imagine a better world, why would we even bother trying to create one?
Exactly. It's about hope.
It is. And that's something I'm really excited to dive into more.
Me too.
So stay tuned for that.
Can't wait.
Okay. So we've talked about the power of art to grab attention, to bypass our intellectual defenses, to disrupt our routine thought patterns. But the book also talks about how utopian visions are essential for inspiring and motivating people towards action.
Yeah. If we can't even imagine a better world, why would we bother trying to create one?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like that quote, without vision, the people perish. But how do we avoid falling into the trap of just daydreaming about this perfect world that might never exist?
Right. We need to ground those utopian visions in reality.
So it's about blending those big, ambitious dreams with practical strategies for actually making them happen.
Exactly. The book actually offers this cool exercise called Mapping Paths to Utopia.
Ooh, I like that. Tell me more.
It involves visually plotting out your journey from the current reality, the problem you're trying to address, to the ideal future that you envision.
Okay, so you start with a drawing of the current situation in one corner of a page, and then a picture of your utopia in the opposite corner.
Exactly.
And then you draw lines connecting those 2 points, representing different paths you could take to reach your destination.
Right. And the key here is to think beyond just the conventional practical steps.
So let your imagination run wild.
Exactly. Brainstorm those seemingly impossible, outlandish ideas that could actually lead to real breakthroughs.
I love that.
It's about giving yourself permission to dream big and then figuring out how to make those dreams a reality.
And the book offers a great example of this in action with a story about a group of activists in Texas who were fighting for a more equitable state budget.
Yeah.
They were up against these deeply conservative politicians who were all about cutting taxes and shrinking social programs.
Sounds like a tough crowd.
It definitely was.
Yeah.
And when they were asked to come up with concrete steps to achieve their utopian vision of a just and equitable society, they initially hit a wall.
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem, especially when you're up against such entrenched opposition.
Right. And it's easy to fall back on those traditional tactics, lobbying, protesting, campaigning. But they felt like those were insufficient, almost too predictable.
Right. They needed something more, something bolder.
Yeah. So they were encouraged to push further, to think outside the box and really embrace those seemingly impossible ideas.
And did they come up with anything?
They did.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And one of the ideas they came up with was especially brilliant. They realized that in Texas, religion played a huge role in shaping public opinion, and they were up against politicians who constantly invoked their Christian faith to justify their policies. So they decided to co-opt it.
Co-opt their religion.
In a way, yeah. But instead of directly challenging those religious beliefs, they came up with this clever plan to run a campaign for Jesus for the governorship of Texas.
Wait, what? Like the actual Jesus?
Not quite. They knew there were plenty of activists in their community with the name Jesus, and they decided to find one who was willing to embrace the role.
Okay, so it was like a performance art piece.
Exactly.
A satirical commentary on the way religion was being used in politics.
Exactly. They imagined this Jesus character participating in debates, giving speeches, and advocating for policies that actually help the poor and marginalized.
That's amazing.
And all while subtly referencing biblical teachings about social justice.
So clever.
Oh, wait.
They were playing the game on their own terms.
Exactly. It's like they took that utopian vision of a just society and ground it in a way that resonated with people's existing beliefs, even those beliefs that were often used to justify the very injustices that they were fighting against.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Right. It's such a great example of how artistic activism can turn the tables and make us re-examine our assumptions in these really unexpected ways. And it also reminds us that humor is such a powerful tool.
Absolutely. Humor can disarm people and make them more receptive to your message.
And it can even turn those in power into objects of ridicule.
Right. It's like a Trojan horse sneaking in a subversive message under the guise of entertainment. It's like a Trojan horse sneaking in a subversive message under the guise of entertainment.
Exactly. So we've talked about utopian visions, disrupting expectations, appropriating cultural symbols, and using humor. What else can we learn from the art of activism? What are some other key takeaways that our listeners can apply to their own lives?
I think one of the most important messages is this idea of making the impossible possible. The book encourages us not to be afraid to dream big, to imagine those seemingly outlandish solutions that could actually lead to real breakthroughs.
Right, because sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that initially seem the craziest.
Exactly. And the world is constantly changing. What seems impossible today might be totally achievable tomorrow.
So we need to stay open to new possibilities and challenge those limitations that we often impose on ourselves.
Absolutely. And the book encourages us to approach activism with a sense of playfulness, to embrace experimentation, and to not be afraid to fail.
Because failure is just a stepping stone to success.
Right, exactly. And even if our efforts don't lead to immediate tangible results, the act of of expressing ourselves, of engaging with the world in a meaningful way is valuable in itself.
It's about the journey, not just the destination, and it's about remembering that we're not alone in this fight. The book highlights the importance of community, of building networks of support, of connecting with others who share our values and passions.
Absolutely. Collective action is always more powerful than individual effort. And when we come together, when we share our ideas and resources, when we support and inspire each other, we can achieve incredible things.
I love that. It's a reminder that even small acts of creativity and resistance can ripple outwards and create a larger wave of change.
Exactly. And the book also emphasizes the importance of moving beyond just raising awareness. It's not enough for people to simply agree with you. They need to actually change their behavior.
How do we bridge that gap between awareness and action? How do we inspire people not just to think differently, but to act differently?
That's where we can borrow some insights from the field of marketing.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The book talks about the 5 Ps of marketing, product, price, place, promotion, and positioning, and how they can be applied to artistic activism.
So thinking about your product as the change you want to see in the world, and considering the price people have to pay to make that change, the place where your message will be most effective, how you'll promote it, and how you'll position it in relation to other ideas or behaviors.
Exactly. It's a really useful framework for thinking strategically about how to achieve your goals. And when it comes to the price of change, the book highlights this interesting psychological concept called loss aversion.
Loss aversion. What's that?
It's this idea that we're more motivated to avoid losses than we are to gain something of equal value. So if you're asking people to change their behavior, you need to be aware of what they might perceive as a loss.
For example, if you're trying to convince people to switch to public transportation, you need to acknowledge the convenience and freedom they might be giving up by not driving their own cars.
Exactly. And then you can counter those perceived losses by highlighting the benefits they'll gain, saving money, reducing their carbon footprint, maybe even having a more relaxing commute. It's about framing the change in a way that minimizes that feeling of loss and emphasizes the potential gains.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about appealing to people's self-interest while also connecting to their values.
Right. And then there's this idea of positioning your message.
Visiting.
It's about understanding how your message fits into the larger cultural landscape. What are the competing narratives, the dominant ideologies, the existing beliefs and values that your message needs to navigate?
It's like understanding the terrain before you launch your campaign.
Exactly. And the book argues that one of the most effective ways to position your message is by tapping into those pre-existing cultural narratives, particularly those found in popular culture.
So instead of trying to create a whole new story from scratch, you're finding ways to weave your message into stories that people already know and love.
That's right. And the book offers some really fascinating examples of how activists have done this, drawing inspiration from everything from blockbuster movies to comic books to street art.
That's so cool. It's about being creative, thinking outside the box, and using whatever tools are available to connect with your audience on a deeper level.
Absolutely. And it's not just about stealing ideas from pop culture. It's about understanding the values and aspirations that those cultural products reflect and finding ways to align your message with those existing desires.
It's about giving people a taste of utopia, a glimpse of a better world that they can actually believe in and get excited about.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that crucial aspect of artistic activism we were talking about earlier, the power of utopian visions.
So how do we effectively incorporate those utopian visions into our activism without falling into the trap of just daydreaming or getting lost in those what-if scenarios?
That's a great question. And the book actually offers some specific strategies for developing those utopian visions and weaving them into our activism. It encourages us to think beyond just the immediate problem we're trying to solve and to envision a larger, more systemic transformation.
So it's not just about fixing the potholes, but about reimagining the entire transportation system.
Exactly. It's about stepping back and asking, what kind of world do we actually want to live in? And then working backwards from that vision to identify the steps we need to take to get there.
That's really powerful. It shifts the focus from just reacting to problems to proactively creating the future we desire.
And the book emphasizes that this process of envisioning utopia shouldn't just be a solitary endeavor. It encourages us to engage in collective dreaming, to bring people together, to share their hopes and aspirations for a better world.
That's beautiful. It's about creating a shared vision that can unite and inspire us to work together towards a common goal.
Right. And when we can tap into that collective energy, that shared sense of purpose, amazing things can happen. Right? And when we can tap into that collective energy, that shared sense of purpose, amazing things can happen.
So we've talked about a lot in this deep dive, the power of art to grab attention, to, really get to our emotions, to disrupt our thinking, to envision a better future.
Yeah.
But now I'm kind of curious, how do we actually put these ideas into practice? What are some concrete steps we can take to become more effective artistic activists?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the book actually offers a lot of really practical advice. One of the key things it emphasizes is the importance of knowing your target audience.
Right.
Like, who are you actually trying to reach with your message?
Yeah.
What are their values and beliefs and motivations?
Makes sense. You want to tailor your approach based on who you're talking to.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
And then the book also talks about the importance of crafting a really clear and concise message.
Yeah.
Like, what's that one key takeaway you want people to remember?
Sometimes I think we try to cram too much information in there, and it just gets lost.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot between being informative and impactful.
Yeah.
And then it also encourages us to think creatively about how we deliver that message.
Yeah.
Can we use humor, satire, visual imagery, music? Like, what format is going to resonate most with our audience?
Yeah. It's about using all the tools in our creative toolbox to make that message as, memorable as possible.
Right. And the book also reminds us that we don't have to do this alone.
Right.
Artistic activism can be a collective effort. We can build coalitions. We can tap into the power of community.
Yeah. There's that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
I love that. And the book has some really great examples of how activists have used art to build those bridges, to foster dialogue, to create a sense of shared purpose.
Yeah. And one thing that really struck me throughout this book was how it really encourages us to embrace experimentation.
Yeah.
To try new things and to not be afraid to fail.
Yeah, because failure is just part of the process.
Right. It's a stepping stone.
Exactly. And sometimes those failures lead to our biggest breakthroughs.
It's about having that growth mindset.
Yes.
Being willing to learn and evolve.
Absolutely. And even small acts of creativity and resistance can make a difference. You don't have to create some masterpiece.
Right.
Or launch this huge campaign.
It's about the little things.
It's about finding those little opportunities in our everyday lives to express our values, to challenge the status quo, and to inspire others.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's what artistic activism is all about. It's about creating a culture of change, shifting the narrative, and making the world a more just equitable and compassionate place.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise.
It's been my pleasure. I hope this conversation has sparked some ideas and maybe even inspired some of our listeners to tap into their own creative power.
I have a feeling it has. And I'm already thinking about some small acts of artistic activism I can incorporate into my own life.
That's fantastic. Remember, every act of creativity, every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to that larger wave of change.
And on that note, thank you so much for joining us on Reader's Podcast. And to all of our listeners out there, keep reading, keep thinking, keep creating, and keep fighting for the world that you want to see.